Guilt. We've all felt it. It does not feel good, but is it good for us? In this episode, I talked to the philosophers Brad Cokelet and John Maley, who are also the editors of The Moral Psychology of Guilt. We talk about the nature of guilt, its function, and if we should get rid of it. I am Aisha Cherry. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, the author of such books as The Case for Rage and Failures of Forgiveness, and your guide through the messy yet beautiful world of human emotions, including guilt. So let's get into it. So let's talk about guilt. So philosophers were very interested in the nature of a thing. That's the first thing that pops in our head. And so my first question is also going to be a big question. And I want to start with you, Brad, first. And then we'll go to Corey, because I think his response to this question is going to be a little bit more controversial. But what is guilt?
Yeah, I think, Corey will talk more about this, but I like the idea that the basic idea is that feeling guilt is some kind of negative feeling. And so I think we started out probably saying like an emotion or something. It's some kind of negative feeling for something you've done. And so that's harmed another person or wronged another person. And I think, guilt, it's got this idea of it's sort of a specific kind of negative feeling, like a bite or some kind of and so that's where a lot of people will talk about maybe it's kind of like an internalized anger or something, like anger from another perspective or something. And so that's the way I think of guilt, that it's very focused on the idea for me about, did you measure up to some legitimate expectation? So that's kind of, to me, and it can be, so it's associated with, if you didn't measure up to that, then how are you going to make amends, or things like that. And it's often applied to individual actions. So it's a kind of like, you recognize you failed to meet an expectation you should have, and you're feeling kind of like bad about that, and you might be feeling like a sense of the anger the person who had the expectation would have, and you're feeling kind of bad about that. So that's how I think of guilt, is, I guess, uh you're sort of feeling the pain from the point of view of someone whose expectation you've let down. That's kind of how I think of it. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a hard question. Right. So let me just say a minute about one thing about why this is really hard. People use the term in lots of different ways, and there are a lot of related emotion feeling terms in the neighborhood, like remorse and regret. And there are enough types of guilt that I think it's really, really hard to have a unified account of guilt that's going to fit all the cases, right? And so part of the hard thing is to say, okay, well, what's the thing that should really count as guilt? And if it doesn't fit what other people call guilt, are they just wrong and they're talking about shame or some other emotion? Or do we need to tweak our account of guilt to try to get those other cases? So just one quick example, like what Brad said, that sounds great, but that doesn't capture things like survivor's guilt, right? Where you didn't do anything wrong at all. You just were the person who survived in some situation, right? We can imagine cases where you did, but the case is the kind of prototypical case where you survived an accident, you didn't do anything special, but you feel guilty about it, right? There's just no way in which you did anything wrong. So for me, so I don't take too long, I think guilt is, it's the feeling where you feel as if you did something wrong, but you might not have actually done it. And so I make one analogy, it's maybe imperfect, is guilt is kind of like feeling betrayed or feeling abandoned, right? Like if you say, I feel betrayed, were you actually betrayed? Who knows, right? But if you feel betrayed, you feel as if a betrayal happened, right? And you can feel betrayed without the betrayal actually happening. But it's a particular kind of what I call feeling, and I distinguish that from emotion, and we don't have to talk about that right now. But it's the feeling as if you've done something wrong. And the complicated cases like survivor's guilt, you have that feeling, but also you know you didn't do anything wrong. So it's like guilt is kind of misfiring, maybe. So that's the short version for now.
Corey, I'm
And
not going to let you out of the, I don't want to talk about that for now. We don't have to talk about that for now. Because
yeah, I
because
know.
what you're not saying is kind of like the controversial part, right? So you're saying it's the feeling, but you specifically distinguish it from an emotion. And this is a So Emotional Book Club. We read books on emotions, but you basically suggest that guilt is not an emotion, it is a feeling. So I wonder if you can just remind us or tell the audience what is the importance of that distinction for you? And what intervention do you think you're making as a result?
So it's controversial what, things should really, what emotions are and whatever they are, which things should count as emotions, right? We don't really have any kind of, I don't think we have any really good way of getting at this except for just thinking about these concepts and the terms that we have. Um, Part of why I want to call it an emotion, I want to distinguish emotions and feelings. I kind of have in mind something like, Ekman's view that there are these kind of basic emotions. I don't know if that's totally right, but something along in that neighborhood where the things that should be called emotions are the things that you can find universally, across all humans. There's a really characteristic display. We uh, there's a kind of behavior. There's a pretty characteristic phenomenology. It feels like a particular kind of thing. And maybe, I mean, Heidi Maybaum has written about this. Maybe there are analogs of those things in non-human animals, right? So Heidi Maybaum has written about shame, for example, in non-human animals. Um, Whereas things like feelings, one of the things that struck me as I was reading a lot about guilt is the way people describe what it feels like. I mean, Brad's right. There's, often like this bite, but not always. By the way, the bite, that's why we chose the cactus on the cover, the sting. Um, but some ways that people characterize guilt is it's more anxiety or more sadness, right? And that varies in ways that don't seem to be particularly systematic. Um, and this is a big topic, but there are cultures that don't seem to really have a label or a term for guilt. Or maybe they experience it, maybe not, but it just isn't doing anything in their conceptual milieu. And emotions aren't like that, right? They're characteristic displays of sadness. Everybody knows what sadness feels like. Um, Other animals experience sadness. So that's all to say part of what I think like what feelings are doing. If I tell you that uh, I feel really betrayed, I feel really abandoned. I mean, I'm feeling something negative, right? But also I'm telling you about how I think I got into that situation. I'm like communicating something to you, right? And I don't know if we just pay attention to what it feels like, if there's a really big difference we can come up with between, the sadness of feeling betrayed, the sadness of feeling abandoned, things like that. What really distinguishes those things is how I'm telling you that I got there, right? And I think guilt's like that. It's going to be negative, but for some people it might be anxiety. Maybe if you grew up with a particular type of religion, maybe if you grew up in a particular just household, whatever. Um, but the emotional component, that kind of feeling, it can just vary a lot. So I'm kind of rambling about this distinction. Um, I haven't thought about this as much as I would like to have. And like I said, I don't want to wed myself to the kind of Paul Ekman picture that there just are some basic emotions, but it seems like there's something to that. So I'll stop there, but
Okay. Okay.
maybe you have more to ask. You can press me as much as you want.
Okay. So that's the nature of guilt. Let's talk about the function of guilt. In the introductory chapter, you all briefly list functional accounts. So I wonder if you all can just briefly talk about what are the different functions of, or what people have said the different functions of guilt is. And I wonder which one of those accounts resonate with you all as scholars, resonate with you all as human beings. Brad?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing, like, so the psychologists have talked a lot about that. So one thing to think about, the basic distinction is there's like a function, like an intrapersonal functional, like a function within a person. And you can think of that, it sort of helps you regulate yourself. So if you feel guilt, that's going to help you live up to whatever expectation you feel, and that might be something you care about. So it might be sort of like in your self-interest, prudent to feel guilt because it helps you, so you might feel guilty because you said you were gonna, lose weight and be on a diet and you didn't do it. And maybe you told other people, or made, and so there's one part is sort of internal. So you could think about that in terms of sort of autonomy, like holding yourself to standards you endorse. You could think that might also be good for you because it's going to benefit you if you can self-regulate. But what psychologists started out talking about more was interpersonal functions. And so they have different ones. I mean, I think the early accounts, this psychologist Lewis and others, so you could think they talk about you may have sort of let down or maybe even just harmed people in your personal relationships. That would be a core case. And so you're feeling guilt, and then they think, well, the function there is somehow it's either signaling the fact you let them down and you intend to do better. It might be signaling the value of the relationship. And so we could talk about different psychologists, but I think that's the basic idea is that the interpersonal function is, you've done something wrong or you failed that expectation. So when you feel guilt and express it and act on it. So it's often connected to behavioral and expressive dispositions. That's going to sort of like maybe repair the relationship or signal you recognize it was a mistake. And so you could see how that would be important for maintaining relationships, maintaining your status among other people in a group that, oops, I messed up over here, but you can trust me next time. So it's not just always about the initial relationship. It can be about your sort of standing as like a competent cooperator or role fulfiller. So that sort of gets, there's different layers to that interpersonal aspect. And then there's this other thing, which is more about self-regulating. And so one thing is the psychologists have over time noticed all of those functions, and they've been trying to kind of develop theories and ways of building experiments that take into account all of these, and then maybe address questions about how could we have evolved to, have this emotion that plays these different complicated roles, like a kind of internal role, and then this external role, and like how does that all work with evolution and developmental psychology? So that's sort of, I don't know, that's like my initial gloss on the different functions. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And there's a bunch of psychological literature. I mean, in the first chapter, I criticize, this popular way of operationalizing guilt. But setting that aside, I mean, there's a lot of literature showing that, people who are more guilt prone, they have all kinds of good outcomes. And then another thing too, one function of guilt in developmental psychology, it seems that what developmental psychologists call guilt induction, like when little kids do something wrong, where you emphasize, I mean, it's kind of like empathy induction, but you say, well, how would you feel if this, your toy was broken or whatever, that kind of strategy leads to the best outcomes for children relative to other strategies, other ways that you might react as a parent to a child, doing something wrong. So, I mean, the overall picture is it seems like it has lots of good functions.
So, given all these good functions, right, guilt is not without its critics. And you all kind of lay out particularly historical critics such as Nietzsche, such as Freud. The ways in which they describe guilt is they use terminology such as disease, such as illness. And I wonder if you can just tell us why, given what you all just said, why would they describe guilt using these metaphors? And do you think, all things considered, that they are appropriate? Now, Brad, I'm going to throw this to you first because you start off by saying that you are bothered or you feel some kind of way when someone admit that they are guilty. So, what's up with this terminology of illness and disease with guilt?
No, that's right. I mean, so one thing is, I think so. One thing we realized rereading this volume we were chatting earlier today is that, there's in the history, there's been some people say, oh, guilt's a great thing. And these like basically a kind of guilt gets played up when individualism really comes on the scene, especially in modern Europe. And people, kind of individualism as a sociological phenomenon comes online and people have a lot more equality and freedom. So there are a lot of good things about individualism. But, I think a lot of people, so some people think that's a good thing and that it's good we leave behind shame cultures, which we haven't talked about, and we have more guilt cultures. So people have this distinction. But then there's another group of people that are worried about guilt. And one thing is, so if you feel guilty, that we even talked about is the experimental evidence is your level of guilt isn't super pushed around by how many other people saw you do the thing or how they're reacting. So a lot of people's feeling of guilt, it sort of tracks their own sense of whether they've done right or wrong. The other thing is it's got a kind of legalistic element where if you feel guilty, you might think, well, okay, I could make up for that. I could like apologize and then wipe the slate clean, and then people should let me off. And so that's where, one worry about guilt is it makes people think the moral life is like there are a set of rules, and as long as they're following all the rules, then everything's okay. And if they mess up, they have to sort of make some amends, and then they can just move on like they never did anything. And so for me, that can kind of encourage people not to really take stock of their character and their traits and kind of like where they're going over time and the kind of person they are. And so that's sometimes I worry when someone, if they feel guilty, they'll really apologize a lot and like, oh, I'll make it up to you. And they might be genuinely motivated to do that, but then how deep is the change really going to be? They don't really seem to be thinking there's something wrong with them. They think there's something wrong with what they did, and they're gonna, they could have done better, and they're gonna do better, and they're sort of telling you that. So that's for me. That's part of the worry is that I think there's a way guilt can be sort of individualistic and sort of people can sort of think they can wipe the slate clean, and so that's one worry. I think Freud and a lot of and Nietzsche too, they think sometimes guilt goes in this kind of crazy direction where people are really beating themselves up. And they feel sort of, it's like there's an internal court. It's like they're being judged, and and so it gets connected to the idea of punishment and wanting to kind of get revenge. And so I think that's another. I'm not really sure, but I think some people think the idea of guilt is like can get sort of almost sadomasochistic, where you're sort of like you're feeling really guilty and you're sort of self-flagellating and you're trying to punish yourself. And again, it's like that seems it's all about you. Like you're not the guilt then isn't motivating you to go talk to the person you wronged or to become a better person. It's sort of like you're it's all about you and you're in your corner and really beating yourself up a lot. And it's like, is that really leading to a good outcome? So I'm sort of that. Yeah. So I guess for me, I'm sort of the mind, like, I don't think I get worried. A lot of people I know, they get overly guilty and they kind of like go in their corner and feel really bad. And then they convince themselves now they can do better. And it's like, they didn't come and like interact with the people that they had the problem with and think about, maybe a long-term change or something. So that's kind of and I think that's sort of like if you read the Breed Blackman chapter on Nietzsche, if anyone's interested, he kind of is pushing that line a little bit. And so I don't know if we can like eliminate all bad feelings and things like that, but that's my sort of vague worry about it. Yeah.
So we can't really talk about guilt. You mentioned shame without kind of talking about shame, although Corey doesn't like that to be the case. So, Corey, I'm going to throw this question to you. What is the difference between guilt and shame, given what you wrote? And what do you think uh, is instrumentally better?
Oh, that depends on what. Okay, first, what's the difference? So I think shame is like more. It's a better candidate for being an emotion because shame is everywhere. It's more emphasized in some cultures than others, but it seems that every culture knows what shame is and has a term for it. Um, and the displays of shame are much more stereotypical. There's a lot, a lot in common between humans and non-human animals for shame displays. Um, Whether it's instrumentally better really depends on what the context is. The psychological research for individuals in North America seem to show that people who are shame prone as opposed to guilt prone generally have a harder time. They're more likely to be depressed and more likely to be uh, punished in the legal system. There's all kinds of bad stuff. Um, in other contexts, shame might be better when we're worried about changing things at more of a group level. Um, and so I don't want to get too off topic, but Anthony Appia has some ideas about the honor code, right? And he has these examples where um, large scale changes, societal changes happened largely because the members of the society were made to feel shame about their practices. So, like the Chinese foot binding was an example, duels, slavery, things like that. And so, at the kind of group level, it seems that inducing shame can be really, really effective for changing, the group behavior. So it's not a simple answer. Um, a simpler answer, the way that psychologists have characterized the difference, which I think there is a kernel of truth to it, is shame is feeling bad about yourself in some way, guilt is feeling bad about an action. Um, but that that's too simplistic. Um, and it gets very complicated because for a long time there's been this supposed distinction between guilt cultures and shame cultures, and again, it's not that simple. Um, but I'm trying not to give you a waffly answer, but it's complicated.
Fair enough. Gotcha. So, last question for me before we open it up to the audience. What do you all think human life without guilt would look like?
Ooh, Brad, you want to go first? You want me to go first?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it would be so my view is like probably feeling guilt is it's like training wheels to me, where like we wouldn't want to totally get rid of it. I mean, it's like, just like when I teach my kids about like you go to school, your kids learn about electrons, they tell you it's circles going around a nucleus, and later you go to take an advanced class, and they're like, that's not really what it's like. And I think guilt is we wouldn't want to eliminate it from the developmental process for human beings, but I think it would be great if people aspired to not need to rely on guilt and to like get themselves to be better people. And also, I think to me, I'm like, it would be nice if you didn't need your people you interact with who you could be close enough, people you could trust. So I mean, so to me, I feel like if you're in a good community with good people who are adults, um, that would be great if we didn't have guilt, because then it would be like, look, if you let someone else down, you might apologize and you would realize you made a mistake and you'd have an intention to do better. And that would be enough. That would be great. I don't think it would be something I'd want the other person to be feeling guilt. But I think the fact is, like, look, we're descended from apes. I'm a believer in evolution, and I think you know, we in certain contexts we need it. So that's how I view guilt as sort of so to me, life without guilt would be a life where human beings are kind of living at their best. But we have to keep it around for when people are not at their best. So that's kind of my take.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Brad said, but it's hard to answer because I think our psychology would have to be just really, really different. Because there are, there are certain scenarios, like a Sophie's Choice kind of scenario, right? Where in the artificial kind of versions, you have two choices and they're both very bad. And if you choose the one that's the least bad, but they're both awful. If you walk away from a situation like that, not feeling guilty or something really bad, we're all going to judge people that do that as psychopaths, right? Sociopaths. There's something wrong with you if you did something that, harmed another person, even if there was nothing else you could do. If you say, well, did my best, I don't feel bad about it, don't feel guilty, we're going to think that person is really, really defective. And that's just a fact about our psychology. Maybe it's true that if we had very different psychology, it would be better if people could walk away from those kinds of situations not feeling bad, because what does feeling bad actually accomplish in the end? It's not that they would have chosen different, or if a similar situation arises, they're going to choose different, but they're going to be judged as terrible people. So given the reality of us as a species, like Brad, I think we're, non-human apes, or sorry, we are human primates. We have to have guilt at some basic level. And I like Brad's analogy of, training wheels. Seems really clear that, when we're learning to be moral people, we have to have some kind of training in guilt, and what are the kinds of things that we should feel bad about, and what do we do when those bad feelings arise, and we have to internalize a lot of that.